A routine morning with surprising troubles. Loretta Carson, a resilient 78-year-old woman, begins her quiet morning with her beloved German Shepherd, Brutus. Her routine is suddenly disrupted when she notices that Brutus refuses to eat, a behavior so unlike his usual energetic self. With growing concern, Loretta decides to take him to a nearby vet clinic she's never visited before, called Harmony Pet Care. Although Loretta tries to maintain calm, memories of her late husband and Brutus's role in helping her cope with his passing make her deeply anxious. She places a call to her son, Marcus, who offers to come, but she insists she can manage. Unbeknownst to Loretta, her decision will soon lead to a confrontation that tests her courage and compassion. The clinic's cold reception. Loretta Carson's heart thudded softly as she walked through the automatic doors of Harmony Pet Care with Brutus, her beloved German Shepherd, at her side. Her fingers, slightly trembling, tightened around his leash as they stepped into the clinic's lobby. The room was filled with muted colors and sleek furniture that looked as if it was designed more for a high-end office than a place that cared for animals. The air had a chemical-clean scent, the kind that covered up more than it revealed. A subtle tension threaded through her, an unease she couldn't quite put her finger on. At the front desk, a young receptionist with platinum blonde hair, meticulously arranged, glanced up from her computer screen. Her name tag read Carla, and her smile looked pleasant but practiced. "Welcome to Harmony Pet Care," she greeted, her voice light and businesslike. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, not exactly," Loretta replied, clearing her throat. "I called earlier. My Brutus, he hasn't been eating. It's not like him. And I'm worried." Carla's eyes softened, if only for a brief moment, as she looked down at Brutus, who was now leaning into Loretta's leg, his usually bright eyes dull and tired. "I see," Carla murmured. "Let's get you set up then. Dr. Hunt will be with you shortly." As Carla started typing on her computer, Loretta filled in the silence by talking softly to Brutus, her voice laced with concern. "It's going to be okay, baby. We're just here to get you feeling better." Her hand moved in small, comforting strokes along his back. Carla glanced up occasionally, but kept her expression polite and unreadable. After a few minutes, Carla motioned to a set of chairs along the far wall. "Please have a seat, Mrs. Carson. Dr. Hunt will see you soon." Loretta gave a slight nod, leading Brutus toward the seating area. She chose a spot near the corner, where Brutus could lie down undisturbed. Loretta ran her hand over his soft fur, trying to ignore the prickling discomfort that had been building since she stepped inside. Harmony Pet Care was her only option close by, and she couldn't drive far anymore. But there was something about this place that felt off. The polished floors, the pristine furniture, the sterile, almost mechanical quietness, all made it feel more like a showroom than a place of healing. Loretta's thoughts were interrupted when a door at the back opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a white lab coat stepped out. Dr. Maxwell Hunt looked to be in his mid-50s, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. His expression was carefully neutral as he scanned the room. When his eyes landed on Loretta, she noticed a fleeting moment of hesitation, something like mild surprise, or perhaps even disinterest, before he approached her with a faint, distant smile. "You must be Mrs. Carson," he greeted her, offering his hand with the same mechanical friendliness as Carla. "I'm Dr. Hunt. It seems your dog isn't feeling well." "Yes, Dr. Hunt," Loretta said, trying to match his tone with politeness, despite the prickling unease she felt. "This is Brutus. He hasn't touched his food since last night, and he's been listless all morning. It's just not like him." Dr. Hunt crouched down, examining Brutus with a cursory glance. Loretta noticed he didn't introduce himself to Brutus or make any soothing gestures, as their old vet, Dr. Cummings, used to do. He simply observed with clinical detachment before standing up briskly, brushing off his coat. "Well, there are several possibilities here," he said, voice low and precise. "We'll have to run some tests, of course, but I can get a sense of things once I take him to the back. Loretta hesitated. Couldn't you do some of the checks here? Brutus tends to get anxious around strangers. I feel better if I could stay with him. Dr. Hunt's smile tightened ever so slightly, and his gaze shifted toward the exam room. I assure you, Mrs. Carson, our facilities are state-of-the-art, and the best way for me to get an accurate diagnosis is with him in the examination area. You can stay here and relax. His tone, although polite, brooked no argument, as though he expected Loretta to comply without question. She bit her lip, feeling the weight of her age and her uncertainty. She knew what was right for Brutus, but Dr. Hunt's manner left her feeling small and foolish for even questioning him. Of course, Loretta said finally, swallowing her reluctance. Just, please, be gentle with him. He's a sensitive boy. Dr. Hunt barely nodded before motioning Carla to assist. Loretta knelt down, meeting Brutus's eyes, trying to convey calmness in her own. It's okay, Brutus. You're going to be fine. I'll be right here waiting, okay? Brutus gave a low, uncertain whine, but he followed Carla into the back, his head turning to watch Loretta until they rounded a corner. Once they disappeared, Loretta felt a pang of regret, wishing she had insisted more firmly. But it was too late now. All she could do was hope. She glanced around the waiting room, trying to settle her nerves. But as the minutes ticked by, an odd feeling crept over her, growing stronger with each passing second. The clinic was too quiet. She hadn't seen anyone else here. No other pets, no signs of movement beyond Carla at the front desk, now staring intently at her computer. Harmony Pet Care was known to be one of the more popular clinics in the area, so why did it feel so deserted? As her thoughts spiraled, Loretta suddenly heard a muffled commotion from the back. It was faint, but distinct, the sound of something heavy falling, followed by a man's raised voice, sharp and angry. Loretta stiffened in her seat, straining to hear more. Her heart hammered as she glanced toward Carla, but the receptionist was seemingly oblivious, eyes still glued to her screen. Loretta stood, her worry for Brutus overpowering her sense of politeness. She approached the desk cautiously, her voice low. "Excuse me, but is everything all right back there?" Carla looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes before she quickly composed herself. "Oh yes, Mrs. Carson. Dr. Hunt can sometimes get firm with our more anxious patients. It's nothing to worry about. He has things under control." Loretta forced a smile, though her unease only deepened. "I'd just like to make sure Brutus is okay. He's all I have left, you know." Carla's face softened, but there was an edge of discomfort in her eyes, as if she didn't quite know how to respond. "Dr. Hunt will come out soon with an update, I promise. It's best to wait here." With a slight nod, Loretta returned to her seat, but her thoughts were far from settled. As she sat, another faint noise reached her, something like a distressed whine, muffled but unmistakable. Her stomach twisted painfully, every maternal instinct screaming at her to get up and demand to see Brutus, but she felt trapped, bound by her trust in a clinic she knew nothing about. She forced herself to stay calm, waiting, willing her hands to stop trembling. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Hunt finally emerged from the back. His face was set in a serious expression, his movements brisk and purposeful as he approached Loretta. "Mrs. Carson," he began, his voice steady but devoid of warmth, "I'm afraid your dog's condition is more severe than we initially thought. I recommend an immediate procedure to assess his digestive tract. It's a complex and delicate operation, but it may be necessary to save him." Loretta's mouth went dry. "An operation? But he's never had any issues with his digestion before. What makes you think it's that serious?" Dr. Hunt's gaze flickered with impatience, as though he were holding back frustration. "I'm the professional here, Mrs. Carson. My experience tells me this is the best course of action if you want your dog to survive." Loretta was taken aback by his tone, a sharpness that reminded her of the way she'd been treated years ago, when she and her husband had faced challenges in getting fair service. The memory stung, bringing with it an old anger she thought she'd left behind. "But are you sure? Could we maybe try medication first, or get a second opinion?" Dr. Hunt's face darkened. "Mrs. Carson, if you're not willing to trust my expertise, then perhaps you're not as concerned about your dog's well-being as you claim." Loretta felt the sting of his words, felt her face grow hot. But she squared her shoulders, her voice coming out firm. "I am concerned about him, which is why I'd like to know my options. Brutus isn't just a dog to me. He's family." Dr. Hunt's eyes held hers, cold and unyielding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he gave a curt nod, but there was no mistaking the hint of disdain in his voice. "Very well. I'll arrange for a second opinion, though it may take some time. Until then, I suggest you consider your dog's health more carefully." As Dr. Hunt turned and walked away, Loretta sat back down, her heart pounding. She knew she'd made the right choice, but a gnawing worry had taken root. She didn't trust Dr. Hunt's intentions, but she had nowhere else to turn. All she could do was hope that Brutus would be safe until she found another way forward. A startling discovery. Loretta Carson sat in the cold, clinical waiting room of Harmony Pet Care, her heart pounding as she watched the sterile doors that led to the examination rooms. She gripped her phone tightly, considering calling her son, Marcus, again just to hear his calm, steady voice. Dr. Hunt's brusque demeanor and evasive responses had left her with a gnawing feeling of dread. Her mind kept drifting back to Brutus, alone with a stranger who seemed far from the compassionate vet she'd hoped for. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching the knot of worry in Loretta's chest. She closed her eyes, remembering the way Brutus's soft brown eyes had looked up at her that morning, pleading and vulnerable. He was all she had left of her life with Thomas, her late husband. Losing Brutus felt unthinkable. Just as Loretta's worry reached a breaking point, a door swung open with a sharp clang. A young woman in scrubs emerged, her face tight with irritation, as she glanced around before her eyes settled on Loretta. She appeared to be in her 20s, with chestnut brown hair pulled back in a tight bun and faint lines of exhaustion under her eyes. She looked around cautiously before approaching Loretta, her footsteps hurried. "Mrs. Carson," she whispered, casting a wary glance toward the back of the clinic before focusing her attention on Loretta. "I'm Sarah, a vet tech here. I just wanted to, check in with you." Loretta's eyes widened as she met Sarah's gaze. "Oh, thank you, dear. I've been worried about Brutus. Dr. Hunt said he needs a surgery, but he wouldn't really explain why. Do you think it's really that serious?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. She lowered her voice further, glancing over her shoulder. "Listen, Mrs. Carson, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I think you should consider getting a second opinion." Loretta blinked in surprise, her heart rate quickening. "A second opinion? Why? Has something happened to Brutus?" Sarah's face softened, but her voice held a tone of urgency. "Dr. Hunt, he's known for recommending invasive procedures. A lot of us here, we don't always agree with his methods, but he's the head vet, so we don't really have a say." She swallowed, casting another furtive glance toward the back. "I'm telling you this because I can see how much Brutus means to you, and I wouldn't want you to do anything you might regret." Loretta's hand shook slightly as she processed Sarah's words. "So you're saying he might not need surgery at all?" Sarah looked as if she was about to answer, but was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing from the back hallway. Her face immediately shifted to a more neutral expression, and she straightened, nodding politely to Loretta before hurrying off without another word. Loretta's mind raced. Sarah's warning had unsettled her deeply, leaving her with more questions than answers. She replayed Dr. Hunt's cold dismissal of her concerns, the dismissive way he referred to Brutus as the dog. Her gut told her something was very wrong. She couldn't ignore the voice within her urging her to get Brutus out of there. She stood up, her decision firm. She would go back and demand to see her dog. She would take Brutus to another clinic, even if it meant waiting or traveling farther. With a shaky breath, she squared her shoulders and walked to the receptionist's desk, determination etched into her face. But before she could say a word, the sterile doors swung open again, and Dr. Hunt strode into the lobby, his expression tight and unreadable. He gave Loretta a strained smile, though his eyes held a glint of irritation. "Mrs. Carson," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Brutus's situation is more severe than I initially anticipated. I've prepared the necessary equipment and staff for surgery, and I'll be taking him in shortly. I'll need you to sign some consent forms." Loretta felt her stomach churn. I don't think I want him to go through with it. I'd like to get a second opinion." Dr. Hunt's smile faded, replaced by a flash of irritation that quickly disappeared behind his professional mask. He crossed his arms, his gaze steely. "Mrs. Carson, I assure you, waiting to seek another opinion could be a life-or-death decision. I understand that you're worried, but as I said before, I'm the professional here." Loretta's heart pounded. She knew she was standing on thin ice, challenging someone with Dr. Hunt's experience and authority. But Sarah's warning echoed in her mind, urging her to stand her ground. "I'd still like to see him," she insisted, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please, bring Brutus back out to me." For a brief moment, Dr. Hunt's eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Loretta could feel the tension building, his frustration barely contained as he regarded her with a look bordering on disdain. "Very well," he said, his tone laced with thinly veiled irritation. He motioned to Carla, who nodded and hurried to the back to retrieve Brutus. As Loretta waited, her hands fidgeted nervously, but her mind was resolute. She wouldn't let them pressure her, not when it came to Brutus's well-being. Minutes later, Carla returned, holding Brutus by the leash. He looked weary, his once bright eyes dulled by fatigue. But when he saw Loretta, his tail gave a small, feeble wag, and he managed a faint whine of recognition. Loretta's heart melted at the sight of him, and she knelt down to cradle his head in her hands, pressing a gentle kiss to his brow. "Oh, Brutus, my sweet boy," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm here. We're going home." Dr. Hunt's jaw clenched as he watched the reunion. "Mrs. Carson, I must strongly advise against this decision. You could be jeopardizing Brutus's life by delaying treatment." Loretta straightened, meeting his gaze with a newfound strength she hadn't felt in years. "I appreciate your opinion, Doctor, but I'll be getting a second one elsewhere." Dr. Hunt's face hardened, but he said nothing as she guided Brutus toward the exit. Carla watched them go, a hint of relief mingling with sympathy in her expression. As Loretta reached the door, she caught Sarah's eye once more. The young vet tech gave her a small, encouraging nod, silently affirming Loretta's decision. Loretta felt an enormous weight lift off her shoulders as she and Brutus stepped out of Harmony Pet Care and into the fresh air. The warmth of the morning sun filled her with a renewed sense of clarity. Brutus was safe in her care once more, and she was more determined than ever to do right by him. After a brief stop to let Brutus rest, Loretta searched her phone for another nearby clinic. She found one about 30 minutes away, in a small neighboring town. It was farther than she would normally drive, but after what she'd just experienced, she was willing to make the journey. As they rode together in the back of an Uber, Loretta kept her hand on Brutus's back, her fingers moving in gentle, soothing circles. "It's going to be all right, Brutus," she whispered. "We're going to find someone who truly cares." When they arrived at the new clinic, the difference was immediately apparent. The waiting room was smaller, less polished than Harmony's, but it had a warmth and charm that eased Loretta's nerves. A receptionist with a friendly, open smile welcomed them, offering Brutus a treat and patting his head. After a short wait, a young vet named Dr. Alvarez, with kind eyes and a gentle voice, led them into an exam room. He listened intently as Loretta described Brutus's symptoms, nodding thoughtfully and taking careful notes. His calm, respectful demeanor was a welcome contrast to Dr. Hunt's dismissive attitude. After a gentle examination, Dr. Alvarez looked up at Loretta with a reassuring smile. "I don't think we're dealing with anything serious here, Mrs. Carson. It sounds like a minor stomach upset. likely from something he might have eaten or a simple digestive issue. I'll prescribe some medication and will monitor him closely. There's no need for surgery." Loretta felt a rush of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She reached down to hug Brutus, pressing her face into his warm fur as she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being so honest with me. I didn't feel that same care at the last clinic, and it frightened me." Dr. Alvarez's expression turned sympathetic. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Mrs. Carson. It's important for vets to remember that animals aren't just patients. They're family, and they deserve to be treated with respect and compassion." Loretta nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart. She left the clinic with a renewed sense of hope, her faith in humanity restored by Dr. Alvarez's kindness. As she and Brutus headed home, she knew she'd made the right choice. Her decision to protect Brutus had brought her face to face with her own strength and resilience, and she silently vowed never to let anyone diminish her instincts again. But as she drove away, a quiet, lingering anger simmered within her. She knew that what she'd experienced at Harmony Pet Care was more than just a bad interaction. It was a betrayal of the trust every pet owner places in their vet. And as she held Brutus close, Loretta began to wonder if there was a way to prevent others from falling into the same trap. Confronting the vet. The day after her unsettling visit to Harmony Pet Care, Loretta Carson couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something terrible. She sat in her cozy living room, Brutus at her feet, his breathing steady as he slept. Dr. Alvarez's diagnosis had been reassuring, confirming that Brutus's condition was minor and manageable. Still, the anger and suspicion from her experience at Harmony gnawed at her. As the morning sunlight filtered through her lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the carpet, Loretta's thoughts returned to the young vet tech, Sarah, and her quiet warning. Sarah had risked her position to advise Loretta to seek a second opinion, hinting at deeper issues with Dr. Hunt's methods. That gesture had saved Brutus from unnecessary surgery, and for that, Loretta felt both gratitude and responsibility. She couldn't sit by knowing that other pet owners, trusting and unsuspecting, might be misled by Dr. Hunt. Taking a steadying breath, Loretta picked up her phone and dialed the local veterinary board. The receptionist answered, and after a few formalities, Loretta found herself connected to a representative who listened patiently as she recounted her experience. She made it clear that she wasn't only concerned about Brutus, but about the other pets and owners who might be misled by Dr. Hunt's practices. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mrs. Carson," the representative said. "We take all complaints seriously, especially those regarding medical ethics and patient safety. We'll start an investigation and keep you informed if there are any updates." With that, Loretta hung up, feeling a mix of relief and determination, but she knew that reporting Dr. Hunt might not be enough. Harmony Pet Care was a reputable clinic with an image carefully crafted to draw in clients. Loretta couldn't stop thinking about how polished and almost too perfect everything looked, as if it were meant to impress but not necessarily to comfort. She wondered if anyone else had stories similar to hers, people who might be willing to come forward. That thought lingered as she poured herself a cup of tea, her gaze drifting to the faded photo of her late husband, Thomas, on the mantel. He'd been a firm believer in justice, in standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. She could almost hear his voice in her mind, encouraging her to dig deeper, to make sure no one else had to experience what she'd gone through. Later that day, after a long walk with Brutus to clear her mind, Loretta sat down at her computer. With a quick search, she found a local online pet owners group and joined. Posting under the title, "Seeking Experiences with Harmony Pet Care," Loretta described her story carefully, focusing on her doubts about Dr. Hunt's rush to surgery and her gratitude for the warning from Sarah. She didn't expect much, maybe 1 or 2 comments, but within hours her post had dozens of responses. One by one, other pet owners shared eerily similar stories. A man named James recounted how his healthy Labrador had been diagnosed with a supposedly urgent issue and had undergone surgery, only to suffer complications that left him in poor health. Another woman, Dina, spoke of her cat being recommended for surgery due to what Dr. Hunt had claimed was a severe tumor. But after a second opinion, it turned out to be a harmless cyst. Comments continued pouring in, each account filled with frustration, regret, and a haunting sense of betrayal. Reading these stories filled Loretta with both anger and resolve. It was clear now. Dr. Hunt's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. She knew she couldn't stop here. A few days later, armed with a list of names and contact information from those who had shared their stories, Loretta made her way to the local community center, where she'd arranged to meet some of the other pet owners. She wanted to bring everyone together in person, to talk openly, to plan a way forward. The room filled gradually as each person arrived, their faces a mix of sadness and determination. Loretta introduced herself and shared her story again, encouraging everyone to speak. One by one, people shared accounts of their experiences with Dr. Hunt, recounting his dismissive attitude, rushed diagnosis, and insistence on costly, invasive treatments. "I wish I'd trusted my instincts," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "My poor dog was never the same after that surgery. It's like they didn't care about him, only the procedure." Dina added tearfully, "I feel so guilty. I should have listened to the little voice in my head telling me to walk away." As each story unraveled, the group's anger and sense of betrayal intensified. They were united by a shared purpose now, to ensure no one else had to go through what they had. Loretta proposed they file a collective complaint, showing the vet board that this was more than a single incident. It was a pattern of behavior that had harmed their pets and violated their trust. With letters written, emails sent, and documents gathered, Loretta and her newfound allies felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were determined to be heard, to shine a light on Dr. Hunt's harmful practices. But Loretta wasn't finished. She knew the power of stories and decided to reach out to the local news. When she called the editor of the town's newspaper, The Beacon, she explained their experiences and the importance of public awareness. The editor was immediately interested, agreeing to meet with Loretta and a few others from the group for an interview. On the day of the interview, Loretta felt a mixture of nerves and hope. As the reporter asked questions, Loretta shared her story once more, detailing the subtle dismissiveness she'd felt and the cold, almost mechanical way Dr. Hunt had treated her concerns. "I just want people to be aware," Loretta said, her voice clear and strong. "Our pets are family, and we deserve to feel that the people we trust with their lives are honest and compassionate." The article hit the stands a week later, its headline reading, "Local Vets Practices Under Scrutiny. Community Calls for Accountability at Harmony Pet Care." The piece included quotes from Loretta, James, Dina, and others, painting a vivid picture of their collective experiences and concerns. The article struck a chord with the community, sparking a wave of outrage. Soon, social media was abuzz with comments and shares, as people across the town voiced their support and demanded answers. A few days after the article was published, the Veterinary Board reached out to Loretta. They had launched a formal investigation into Dr. Hunt's practices and were in the process of reviewing the complaints submitted by her and the other pet owners. Loretta felt a wave of relief, tempered by the knowledge that there was still a long road ahead. One afternoon, Loretta received a call from Sarah, the vet tech who had initially warned her about Dr. Hunt. Her voice was filled with gratitude as she explained that the publicity and investigation had led to changes within the clinic. Harmony Pet Care was being inspected by a third party, and Dr. Hunt was temporarily suspended from his duties. "Thank you, Mrs. Carson," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "What you've done, it's going to help a lot of people. I'm just glad someone finally spoke up." As Loretta hung up, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She'd started this journey scared, uncertain, and simply wanting to protect Brutus. But along the way, she had found strength in her purpose, standing up for not only her own beloved companion, but for countless others. She knew Thomas would be proud, and as she looked at Brutus, content and healthy at her feet, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. That evening, she posted a final message in the pet owners group. "Thank you to everyone who stood with me in this fight. Our voices mattered, and because of all of us, change is coming. Remember, never ignore your instincts, especially when it comes to those you love. Together, we are stronger." Loretta closed her computer, feeling the weight of all they'd accomplished together. As she settled into her armchair, Brutus curled up beside her, his head resting on her knee, his gentle presence a reminder that love and loyalty could drive anyone to extraordinary lengths. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, Loretta knew that she had honored her beloved Brutus and Thomas, standing up for the voiceless with courage and integrity. A shocking revelation. Days after the article in the Beacon spread through town, the effects of Loretta's actions rippled outward. It was clear that the piece had captured the community's attention. Even those who had never visited Harmony Pet Care were now aware of Dr. Hunt's controversial practices. Pet owners, animal lovers, and concerned neighbors were sharing the story on social media, discussing it in coffee shops, and even calling into local radio shows to voice their outrage. The community was behind Loretta and the group of pet owners she had rallied, united in their demand for accountability. But the publicity brought more than just outrage. It brought scrutiny from unexpected quarters. Soon after the article's release, Loretta received a call from Detective Evelyn Ward, an investigator with the state's veterinary board. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was an unmistakable urgency in her tone. "Mrs. Carson, I wanted to thank you for bringing these issues to light," she began. "Your group's accounts were the catalyst we needed to conduct a thorough investigation. I'd like to keep you updated, if you don't mind." Loretta agreed, a mixture of relief and curiosity flooding her. She'd had no idea her efforts would reach beyond her local community, but knowing that the authorities were taking her claims seriously filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Loretta stayed in close contact with the other pet owners, sharing updates from Detective Ward. She attended meetings at the community center, where more people came forward, sharing their stories and offering support. The group quickly realized that they had only scratched the surface of Dr. Hunt's practices. One by one, more pet owners recounted horror stories of their experiences at Harmony Pet Care, their voices filled with regret, anger, and sadness, and each story added to the mounting evidence against Dr. Hunt. One evening, Detective Ward contacted Loretta with an update. Her tone was steady, but Loretta could hear a hint of shock as the detective revealed the latest findings. "Mrs. Carson, we've discovered something deeply troubling. As we reviewed the clinic's files, we found a pattern of suspiciously high numbers of surgeries performed by Dr. Hunt compared to other vets in the area. Many of these procedures were, according to our veterinary consultants, unnecessary and, in several cases, harmful." Loretta felt a chill run down her spine. "Unnecessary," she repeated, struggling to keep her voice steady. "But why would he put pets through that if they didn't need it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Detective Ward were choosing her words carefully. "It seems that Dr. Hunt was profiting from these surgeries, Mrs. Carson. According to our findings, Harmony Pet Care charges premium fees for its services, and surgeries represent a significant portion of the clinic's revenue. The evidence suggests that Dr. Hunt may have been exploiting pet owners' trust and their love for their animals to increase profits." Loretta's heart clenched. She thought of Brutus, her sweet, loyal companion, and the unnecessary pain he might have endured had she not listened to Sarah's warning. The knowledge that Dr. Hunt was willing to harm innocent animals, preying on their owners' vulnerability for financial gain, filled her with anger. "What will happen to him now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're building a case to revoke his veterinary license permanently," Detective Ward said. "There's more. Several former employees have come forward, sharing their own observations and experiences. They described instances of Dr. Hunt ignoring basic safety protocols and cutting corners, especially with anesthesia and post-operative care. to maximize efficiency and profit. These testimonies have strengthened our case and will be recommending formal charges. Loretta thanked Detective Ward, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Though she was grateful for the progress, her heart ached for the animals and owners who had been betrayed by someone they had trusted. But the investigation also brought a renewed sense of responsibility. She realized that while she'd started this journey with Brutus in mind, it had grown into something far bigger. Loretta became the unofficial spokesperson for the group, meeting with local journalists, speaking at community events, and sharing her story with anyone who would listen. She wanted to make sure no one else would have to face the heartache and betrayal that so many others had endured. Meanwhile, the public response to the unfolding scandal was intense. Pet owners who had never even been to Harmony Pet Care were horrified by the reports, expressing their anger on social media and organizing fundraisers for the affected families. Animal rights activists began using Loretta's story as a rallying point, calling for stronger regulations on veterinary practices. One evening, while Loretta was checking emails from supporters and journalists, she received a message from Sarah, the brave vet tech who had first alerted her to Dr. Hunt's questionable practices. Sarah wrote to thank Loretta, explaining that she'd found a position at a new clinic that prioritized animal welfare over profit. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Carson," Sarah wrote. "Without you, I don't know if any of us would have found the courage to speak up. I'll always be grateful for that." Reading Sarah's words brought tears to Loretta's eyes. She thought back to the moment she had considered leaving the clinic without saying anything, trusting the process and accepting whatever diagnosis Dr. Hunt had handed down. She was grateful she hadn't done so. Her choice to question Dr. Hunt and to speak out had protected not only Brutus, but countless other pets and their owners. A few days later, Loretta received a letter in the mail. It was from the Veterinary Board, notifying her of Dr. Hunt's suspension and outlining the charges he now faced. There were allegations of malpractice, fraud, and animal cruelty, among others. His license had been suspended indefinitely, pending trial. The sense of justice was both satisfying and bittersweet. She thought of all the pet owners who had trusted Dr. Hunt, those who had lost beloved pets or watched them suffer unnecessarily. But Loretta knew they had turned their pain into something powerful. Their collective voice had broken the silence, and together, they had made a difference. In the days that followed, Loretta's story continued to spread. She received messages of support from people all over the state, even from those who had never owned a pet but felt moved by her bravery. Her mailbox filled with letters, some from people who shared similar experiences, others simply expressing gratitude for her courage. Each message was a reminder of the power of community, of standing up for what was right, even when it seemed daunting. One evening, as she sat with Brutus curled up at her feet, Loretta received a call from a local radio station. The host wanted her to share her story live on air, to speak to other pet owners about the importance of advocating for their pets' well-being and trusting their instincts. During the interview, Loretta spoke from the heart. She recounted her journey, from the initial worry she'd felt for Brutus to the moment she'd decided to speak out. She talked about Sarah's bravery and the way the community had rallied around her, and she shared the one lesson she wanted everyone to remember. "Trust your instincts," she said, her voice strong and clear. "If something doesn't feel right, if someone dismisses your concerns, don't be afraid to ask questions. Our pets rely on us to protect them, and it's our duty to make sure they're safe. Sometimes standing up isn't easy, but it's always worth it." When the interview ended, Loretta was met with a wave of calls and messages from listeners, each one offering encouragement and gratitude. It was then that Loretta realized the full extent of what she'd accomplished. Her story had sparked a movement, inspiring others to speak up and take a stand, not just for their pets, but for anyone who couldn't fight for themselves. And though she still felt a lingering sadness for the pets and people who had been hurt by Dr. Hunt's actions, she knew that together, they had made a difference. As she reached down to stroke Brutus's head, she whispered a quiet promise to him. She would always stand up for what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. Because sometimes love and loyalty meant having the courage to change the world, even if it started with something as small as protecting the life of a cherished friend. Justice and a new chapter. Months had passed since Loretta Carson had first stepped into Harmony Pet Care, a day that had changed everything she believed about trust and community. In that time, the investigation into Dr. Hunt's practices had intensified, bringing shocking truths to light. Reports of unnecessary surgeries and fraudulent charges filled the news, painting a picture of a man driven by greed and arrogance. The charges against him now included multiple counts of malpractice, fraud, and animal cruelty. The Veterinary Board had suspended his license, and local prosecutors were building a case that could lead to serious consequences. Yet, as the investigation unfolded, Loretta's influence grew, transforming her from an elderly pet owner fighting for her dog to a local hero who had sparked a movement. Her story had inspired countless people to question, to stand up, and to trust their instincts. Messages continued to pour in from strangers, pet owners, animal lovers, and even individuals from across the country who felt touched by her bravery. One day, Loretta received an invitation to a town hall meeting organized by the community's Animal Welfare Association. The meeting, they explained, was to discuss new guidelines for local veterinary practices and the potential for statewide reform. Loretta's story had shed light on the need for stricter oversight in veterinary clinics, and the association hoped to introduce legislation that would ensure higher standards of care. The invitation honored her as a guest of distinction, recognizing her role in sparking change. Nervous but determined, Loretta accepted. She couldn't deny that the idea of speaking publicly in front of local leaders and community members was intimidating, but she felt it was her duty to represent all those who had trusted her with their stories. When the evening of the town hall arrived, Loretta dressed in her best suit, one that had belonged to her late husband, Hamas. His memory gave her strength, reminding her of the values they had shared, the belief that even small acts of justice could have a big impact. Brutus watched her as she got ready, his tail thumping against the floor in silent encouragement. She knelt down, scratching him behind his ears, her voice soft. "You're the reason I'm doing this, Brutus, because you deserve the best, and so does every other creature." When Loretta arrived at the town hall, the room was filled with a sense of anticipation. Community members, pet owners, and local officials had gathered to hear from advocates, veterinarians, and concerned citizens about how the town could prevent tragedies like those uncovered at Harmony Pet Care. Loretta felt a wave of pride as she saw familiar faces, James, Dina, and others from the group she'd formed, smiling and waving at her. Their support gave her courage. As the meeting progressed, officials discussed potential reforms, routine inspections of veterinary clinics, clear reporting of all procedures, transparent billing practices, and the formation of a local board where pet owners could raise concerns. It was clear that the community was serious about taking action, determined to prevent any future abuses. Then, the moderator introduced Loretta, describing her as the heart of the movement, the person who had taken a stand and inspired so many others to come forward. Loretta's cheeks flushed as the audience applauded, a warm wave of support filling the room. Taking a deep breath, Loretta stood, clutching the edges of the podium as she began to speak. "I never imagined that speaking out about Brutus, my dear dog, would lead me here today," she started, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength. "I'm just a woman who loves her pet, as so many of you love yours. When I took Brutus to Harmony Pet Care, I trusted that the people there cared as much as I did. I was wrong. But that experience taught me something I'll never forget, that we have to stand up for those who can't speak for themselves." Loretta's voice grew stronger as she continued, sharing the importance of listening to one's instincts and speaking up, even when it felt difficult or intimidating. We all want to believe that the people we trust with our loved ones, whether they have 2 legs or 4, are there to protect and help them. And most of them are. But when we see something wrong, when someone's trust is broken, we have to act. not just for our own sake, but for others who might face the same injustice. As she spoke, she saw people in the audience nodding, some wiping away tears. She realized that her words were resonating, that her story had connected with something deep within them, a shared belief in compassion, love, and responsibility. Loretta finished her speech with a simple but powerful message. Let's create a world where we don't have to worry about those who hold our loved ones' lives in their hands. Let's make sure that every creature, no matter how small, is treated with dignity and respect. The applause that followed filled the room, a thunderous sound that echoed in Loretta's heart long after the meeting ended. She had spoken her truth, and it had been heard. She knew Thomas would have been proud. In the following weeks, changes swept through the town. New regulations for veterinary clinics were drafted, inspired by the recommendations from the town hall meeting. Local officials worked with the state veterinary board to establish oversight committees that would conduct regular inspections of clinics and create a channel for pet owners to raise their concerns without fear. The impact of Loretta's actions was visible everywhere. She'd started a ripple effect that would ensure the safety of countless animals in her community and beyond. And Harmony Pet Care. The clinic was forced to shut down, its reputation tarnished beyond repair. Dr. Hunt's trial began soon after, with a parade of witnesses recounting their stories of unnecessary procedures, neglected aftercare, and the emotional toll of betrayal. Loretta attended the trial, not out of anger, but out of a need for closure. She listened as Dr. Hunt was finally held accountable, his years of harmful practices laid bare. When the judge handed down a sentence that included restitution to the affected families and a lifetime ban on practicing veterinary medicine, Loretta felt a weight lift. Justice had been served, not just for her and Brutus, but for every pet and owner who had suffered. With the trial behind her, Loretta felt ready to move forward. Her life returned to a quieter rhythm, but she carried the experience with her, a reminder of her strength and resilience. She and Brutus took long walks together, exploring the parks and trails in their town, savoring every moment of companionship. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Loretta felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her journey had been challenging, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but she had come out stronger, guided by love and the quiet courage she had discovered within herself. She knew that she had created a legacy, a lasting change that would protect the animals she loved so dearly. And though her days of public speaking and community organizing had ended, her impact would live on. Loretta's story became something of a local legend, inspiring others to stand up for what they believed in, to question when something felt wrong, and to trust their instincts, no matter how small they felt. As she looked down at Brutus, now curled up at her feet, his head resting on her slippers, she smiled, feeling the warmth of love and gratitude fill her heart. She reached down to stroke his fur, her voice soft and steady. "We did it, Brutus. We made a difference." And in the stillness of that moment, with the cool evening air settling around them, Loretta knew that her journey had come full circle. She had fought for her beloved Brutus, for the animals of her community, and for the belief that everyone deserved a voice, even those who couldn't speak for themselves. And as she sat there, hand resting on her loyal companion, Loretta felt a quiet joy, knowing that she had, indeed, changed the world, one small act of love at a time.